Good morning to you. Here's a question. When was it, please, that a no-deal exit from the EU became, for so many people, the only real, acceptable, legitimate Brexit? Was it after the European elections and the rise of the Brexit Party? Has it really only come about more recently, during the Tory leadership contest? But it's quite a thing. Only a year ago, a no-deal Brexit was regarded as an outlandish and very unlikely possibility hovering at the edge of things. Now it's centre stage, right in front of our noses. I ask again, when did that happen? Well, I'm joined this morning by our key Cabinet Minister, Amber Rudd, who now sounds as if she's making her peace with a possible no-deal Brexit, and with Labour having finally shifted to a pro-Remain position in a future referendum. I'm joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry. The Liberal Democrats want to stop Brexit entirely, but who will be their leader? Sir Ed Davey is here. And it's a massive day, of course, for cricket. England are playing later on, but what toll does it take on the players? The former England captain, Andrew Strauss, has been telling me about the triumphs and trials of the game and his hopes for an England victory today, as well as in the Ashes.
It's a very, very exciting thing to see England on the up and playing the right style of cricket. I'm very hopeful that trend continues.
Reviewing the news, Grace Blakely from the New Statesman, the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and the Good Morning Britain presenter and star, Susanna Reid. All of that coming up soon, but first the news with Nina Warhurst.
Andrew, good morning. Leaked documents from Britain's former ambassador to the United States have been made public. That's despite a warning from police not to publish them. The Mail on Sunday says that in one of them, Sir Kim Darroch accuses President Trump of diplomatic vandalism over his decision to abandon the nuclear deal with Iran. Scotland Yard has faced criticism for telling journalists that they could face prosecution. Both Conservative leadership contenders have defended the rights of the press to publish the document. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, described it as a vital part of the UK's democracy.
We have one of the most vibrant, free media in the world. And this is a country that has always been known for standing up for democratic values. And so we have to make sure that we defend the right of journalists to publish leaks when they are in the national interest and when national security hasn't been compromised.
The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has warned the UK will not be able to control key elements of a no-Brexit deal should we leave the EU without a deal later this year. In an interview with BBC Panorama, Mr Hammond said that the EU will control most of the process, including what happens at the French port of Calais. The former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, meanwhile, told the programme that Whitehall never believed that a no-deal Brexit would happen. Britain's Brexit crisis is on BBC One this Thursday. A man has been charged with the murder of a heavily pregnant woman and the manslaughter of her baby in South London. Kelly Mary Favrell, who was 26, was stabbed to death at her home in Croydon last month. Her son Riley was delivered by paramedics but died later in hospital. NHS trusts, schools and local councils in England and Wales could soon have a legal duty to help tackle serious youth violence under plans by the Home Secretary. Under the proposals, public bodies will have to share data and intelligence to combat crime. The government says that the new rules are designed to build on existing responsibilities. And as Andrew was saying, one match away from making history. England are taking on New Zealand in the Men's Cricket World Cup final at Lords later. It's their first final since 1992 and neither team has won the trophy. So a first either way. That's it from me. The next news on BBC One is at 12:30. Back to you, Andrew.
And even I, as a Scot, am mildly excited about that. Now to the front pages as usual. The Mail on Sunday, instructed by the Metropolitan Police to stop publishing leaks, have responded by publishing more leaks, pages and pages of them, and putting Fighting for Free Speech on their masthead. They've got both Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson supporting the right of the press, and we'll be talking about that a lot in a moment. The Sunday Times, taking a slightly different angle, is trying to work out who is responsible for the leaks and has a personal story about the journalist concerned which we may or may not talk about more later on. The Sunday Telegraph, meanwhile, is on the same theme, but is attacking number 10 officials for putting the police up to attacking the press. This is becoming a really complicated and quite heated story this morning. The Sunday Express has an interview with Nigel Farage, or a piece by Nigel Farage, about his plan to wipe out Labour, he says, now that Labour has made it clear that he's more Remainer than we thought before, perhaps. And finally, then there's The Observer. We're going to be talking about the anti-Semitism row, I'm sure, later on. Some of the whistleblowers who went public are now suing the Labour Party, it says, because they were accused of having mixed motives and being all sorts of things, which I won't talk about on air because it might cause me trouble. However, let's start with free speech. Fraser Nelson.
Well, the Mail on Sunday has come out with 8 to 10 pages of this story, which is a wonderful response to the attempt by police to intimidate it into not publishing anymore. And I'm also struck by how many other people are getting behind the Mail on Sunday. Lots of politicians, lots of other journalists. And I do remember them being very silent not so long ago when journalists were also, tabloid journalists were taken to court for and accused of a non-crime of publishing stories from leaked documents. The idea was that they paid money for it, therefore it was illegal. I mean, jury after jury decided it wasn't illegal, but still there were plenty of people willing to go along with this, while it was certain tabloid journalists getting the police's attention. And since then, we've had this. This is not a one-off. I mean, the police
do say that they are investigating a crime in the sense these were diplomatic cables. This is very much part of the sort of state's secret.
You're right, and they should investigate the government people who broke the law and gave a leak. But to suggest that journalists can be prosecuted for receiving leaks, now that is nowhere in our democracy, in our laws, is that the case.
Although they do seem to have done an about turn on that, firstly suggesting that there might be criminal action against journalists,
pulling back,
and then completely
They're visibly pulling back.
From that, yeah.
Let's talk about the substance of the next set of leaks in the Mail on Sunday today, because this is serious stuff.
So a week on from the original leaks published in the Mail on Sunday, and the journalist Isabel Oakeshott, who's unearthed them. When they originally were leaked, we saw an insight into what Sir Kim Darroch thought of the White House, uniquely dysfunctional and inept, and his views on President Trump. This week, we see something much more substantial and perhaps all of that dysfunction in action. Because this story says that Donald Trump abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, which he described in his election campaign as the worst deal ever negotiated. But the allegation is that he abandoned it as an act of diplomatic vandalism to spite his predecessor, Barack Obama. And this is all in one of those diplomatic cables sent by Sir Kim Darroch.
I'm slightly surprised by the tone of these things. I mean, these are mostly things that columnists or newspaper journalists outside the system could have said in vivid language. I'm not sure what the British government is getting that is new and fresh and surprising from this.
That's what's been exposed, the extent to which Kim Darroch just didn't understand the Trump presidency. He was saying, isn't the economic vandalism, or was he doing what he told the American people he would do when he stood for election?
Also, this is, in many ways, there is something going on in the real world as well, which is that this war of words over Iran is escalating. And, we're potentially America is potentially on the brink of some sort of actual conflict there, an escalation of that conflict. And obviously, given that we are in the midst of a Tory leadership contest, everyone has an incentive to try and look strong and talk up, Britain's role in the world. That's terrifying.
But isn't it absolutely the duty of a diplomat to say it as he sees it in diplomatic cables? And, there was this mad scramble to get the Foreign Secretary, this is back in 2018, to get the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson at the time, out to the States in order to persuade the President to climb down.
So the question then is, why were they leaked and by whom? And the Sunday Times is full of a kind of, it has a theory. I'm not going to call it a conspiracy theory, but it's a theory.
So this is a long and colourful piece by Tim Shipman, linking lots of different, things together. So he starts by talking about how the Brexit Party is potentially involved with this in one way or another. We won't go into the kind of details of that, but there's some insinuation that, this was linked to Farage, who previously said that he wanted this job.
And he now says, not guilty, it's not me.
Well,
Farage
yeah,
says,
exactly. Farage is stepping back from this. But, then we've got a long kind of look into the relationship between Johnson and Kim Darroch, and some insinuation that potentially wasn't as positive as it could have been. And then, perhaps the most interesting piece of this, I thought, was the fact that, the argument that this is all about what happens with this potential free trade deal between the US and the UK when Johnson hopes to get into power. There's going to be a very short time period to potentially be able to negotiate this, and Johnson wants someone amenable in that ambassador position. Now that's quite the free trade deal with America. Remember, before we've had this idea of TTIP, which was the agreement between the US and Europe, and that had a whole host of really scary stuff in it about privatising the NHS, chlorinated chicken, etc. So this is quite an important thing.
To be absolutely clear, if we leave the EU at the end of October, we're going to have to do some kind of trade deal with the States. And what this suggests is that if Johnson has a better relationship with the Trump administration, Trump might pull back a little bit from some of the demands on letting American agricultural produce be part of that deal.
Well, that's one theory. The other theory is that there are many people in the government who don't want Britain to get any closer to America, because if there is no deal Brexit, that will be the big question. Will we be getting too close to the US? There's quite a few people who would quite destabilise that relationship.
Susanna, let's turn to the substance of the piece. Let's turn to the mail piece by David Blunkett. Because the overarching shape of British politics.
Well, I think Brexit has just sent an Exocet missile, hasn't it, through tribal party politics. And I think there are lots of people who would find themselves naturally voting for a political party, just finding that that party's policy has completely changed. David Blunkett, I think, speaks to many of us when he says, just when you think that politics can't possibly get any more confusing, it does. And he's suggesting that there might now need to be pacts between parties, because one party perhaps can't win an outright majority, a pact between perhaps the Conservative and the Brexit Party, if there's a general election, but also talking to his own party, Labour, about doing a deal potentially with the Lib Dems and the Greens.
Let me, if you don't mind, walk our way through this piece, because it's really interesting. He says, first of all, and see whether you agree or not, first of all, he thinks that Boris Johnson will call an election earlier than people think later this year, in the autumn. Yeah. Do you think this is right?
Well, I mean, he says, as things stand, there are very few ways out of this mess. The parliamentary arithmetic, as we, repeat over and over again, means that there can be no majority for a no-deal Brexit. So it might be Boris Johnson's inclination,
if it's Boris Johnson or Jeremy Hunt,
to call a general election.
Clear that parliamentary blockage, and in those circumstances, the front page of the Express, makes it clear the Brexit Party will be looking to do some kind of arrangement with the Tories to knock out a lot of Labour seats in the north. In those circumstances, Blunkett says, actually Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens have to do an alternative alliance. So you have two kind of new alliance parties fighting.
I think a lot of this will change over the course of the campaign. There is a lot of trouble kind of using some of the polling that we've got this far out from an election. And our electoral system is not designed to cope with the kind of multi-party politics that we've got today. So you can imagine some more concentration as the campaign will go on. But really, I mean, given the state of the polls at the moment, with all these kind of parties on about 20-25% each, Johnson does seem to have an incentive to just try and carry on for as long as possible. He doesn't want to do what May did, end up being humiliated by Corbyn, who he perceives as this kind of inept politician.
And yet he's got a commons problem. Can I direct you to the front page of The Observer, which is the Labour Party's current problem, which is the anti-Semitism row.
Yeah.
And two of the many whistleblowers who've come out now threatening to take the Labour Party to court.
Yeah, so this is in the wake of the Panorama documentary from the other week, which drew on the views of 4 former staff members talking about, as they saw it, the problems of anti-Semitism in the party. Now, they're being represented by a kind of famous media lawyer who they want to use to kind of take the party to court. I think there was a quote basically saying that from a spokesperson saying that these former staff members had an axe to grind or something. They're saying that's defamation. I believe the quote was actually that some of them have an axe to grind, so I don't know how that would stand up in court.
Okay. We better not speculate on that.
Yeah. But it's been a devastating
it's been
issue,
a really...
And they don't seem to be able to get a handle on it. And of course, just before the documentary, you had 3 Labour lords resigning and saying that it was no longer a safe
It's
space.
a civil war with Corbyn and the membership on one side, Tom Watson and the MPs on the other. And they're going to go at each other all summer. It's just going to get worse.
Let's talk a little bit about Boris Johnson. I said that he might win, he's going to win. There's an expectation that he's going to win. Jeremy Hunt is still fighting doughtily, but there seems to be an expectation that Boris Johnson will win this, and people are already manoeuvring for jobs in his cabinet.
Well, the race is actually over. I mean, something like 90% of the votes will already have been cast, so the Tories will pretend to go through the motions of a race. In fact, Boris Johnson's thinking already who's going to be in his cabinet. Now, he was quoted yesterday saying we need more women in his cabinet. Well, you've got Amber Rudd and Liz Truss are 2 of those women, but Both of them backed Remain in the referendum. And the big question is who's going to be the Chancellor? Will it be Sajid Javid, the Mail on Sunday suggesting Dominic Raab? But also, one of Boris's concerns is that everybody will say that they agree with him on no deal in order to get into his cabinet. But if it comes down to it, can they be relied upon not to resign?
The worrying thing about this is that we've had so much scrutiny over Brexit, right, over what the candidates believe about Brexit. There has been very little kind of analysis about what Johnson thinks about various other issues, not least the economy. We've seen, this competition over tax cuts between these candidates at a time, a quite furtive time for the British economy. And I think that's quite worrying.
Let's go to the cricket now, because it's a really big day for the cricket. And there's an interesting piece in the Sunday Times by Simon Barnes, who's their very, very experienced and much respected sports correspondent, making the point that television coverage of this is really important too.
Well, his point is that England is in a final today, and yet where is the hype? Where is the national build-up? And because it hasn't been on terrestrial TV, people haven't been tuning in at every stage. I mean, even the women's football this year created a huge buzz, really, a real breakthrough moment for that sport. Even people like me who've never watched a match before, I was gripped at it by the end. And with cricket, you basically, unless you had a subscription, you have not been following it. The final today will be free, but where's the hype?
Yeah, people keep harking back, of course, to the 2005 Ashes, where millions watched and celebrated. And the contrast between that and the numbers who've been watching this World Cup, when we should, as you say, have been absolutely buoyed up by England's success,
though, to be
is
fair
such
to
a shame.
Sky, they have allowed the rights to go on to Channel 4 for the final. And of course, the other big thing is the tennis. I don't know if you were watching.
Yes,
Federer,
it's the Wimbledon men's final today.
Federer Djokovic.
Exactly, it's going to be absolutely fantastic. But I think the other contest people have been watching is between the two Duchesses of Cambridge and Sussex, because of course they were there yesterday at the women's final. And Camilla Long has written quite a I don't know whether to say waspish piece about Meghan. I personally feel sorry for Meghan Markle. I think she's really she's trying to find her feet. She's trying to transition from being a celebrity to being a royal. And there's lots of criticism about her in the press saying, once you're a royal and you're accepting royal money or public money as a royal, you need to be much more public and much more accommodating. Earlier in the week,
we want our money's worth.
Earlier in the week, she came under a lot of scrutiny. Now she seems to have done the right thing finally.
Well, at least the sun is going to be shining on all of this. Thanks for the moment, all very much indeed. The weather, a glorious day for sport. How is it looking at Wimbledon, Silverstone and at Lord's for the Cricket World Cup? Helen Willits has more details. Helen.
Good morning, Andrew. We've had some rain moving through Lord's this morning. Here it is on the radar picture. Slightly worryingly, we've got some showers developing further north, but we've also got high pressure building through all that. So the showers will be few and far between. You can see we've got a lot of sunshine elsewhere across the UK this morning. So very slim chance really now of those showers affecting any of those big sporting events. But just about anywhere could catch a shower, even though they will be pretty isolated throughout the rest of the day. It's quite warm, or it will be quite warm in that sunshine. We've got a bit of a breeze, though, blowing across East Anglia in the southeast, just tempering the feel of the day here. But temperatures generally, for most of us, will be a degree up on those of yesterday, with that strong sunshine winning through. Through this evening and overnight, any showers will fade away. In fact, the cloud returns, actually, across eastern Scotland and eastern England. And it will be a more comfortable night once again in the south, but the temperatures held up in the east because of that cloud, which greets us then tomorrow morning. Fine day for most of us tomorrow, but there could be a few drizzly showers in eastern areas, not the rain that we've had this morning, and that clears away, and then we see the sunshine coming through. And once again, with a light wind regime, just a bit more cloud coming in northern Scotland, it will feel quite warm once again. But generally speaking, later in the week, we see more rain arriving. As for today, fingers crossed, just the slightest outside chance of a shower, Andrew.
Helen, thanks very much indeed. Now, as you might have noticed, there is a contest going on to choose a future Prime Minister. I am, of course, referring to the Liberal Democrat leadership race. Really? I hear you say. Well, one of the candidates, Sir Ed Davey, thinks he could end up in number 10, and he joins me now. Ed Davey, really?
Yes, this is the Liberal Democrat moment to win a people's vote to stop Brexit and then to win the general election afterwards. I think I'm the leader to do that. I've got a plan to stop Brexit with my proposal for a government of national unity. And then I'm putting forward a vision to the party members beyond Brexit, where we tackle the causes of Brexit, the inequality, particularly regional inequality, but we also tackle the other crises, for example, the climate change crisis.
Well, we're going to talk about all of that, I promise you, but you also have experience, you've said. You were in a real cabinet, you were part of the coalition cabinet, which of course a lot of people inside the Liberal Democrats and outside remember for austerity and cuts, and your competitor Jo Swinson has said that she regrets a lot of that. Do you regret things that you did in cabinet at that time?
I don't regret taking millions of low paid out of income tax. I don't regret.
I'm asking you what you did regret, not what you don't regret.
Well, I think we do have to put the other side of the coalition.
Sure, but let me put
we
that...
got 75% of the Liberal Democrat manifesto. We got same-sex marriage. We tackled mental health. We nearly quadrupled renewable energy.
So tell me all the things you didn't regret. Now tell me what you do regret.
Well, because I don't regret all those successes. Okay. Now, there were some compromises we had to make.
So what do you regret?
Because in coalition, believe it or not, you have to make compromises. And there were some cuts, many of the ones that Joe's talked about, that were painful for us.
Do you regret the benefit cuts, for instance?
Well, I don't regret stopping deeper benefit cuts. The Tories would have really trashed...
You don't regret anything, it sounds.
No, I happen to be frank with you that in reality, in coalition government, you have to make compromises. But I'm also clear going forward, we should abolish austerity. It's really clear that the public finances can now afford the investment that we need to tackle inequality, to invest in education, to deal with the crisis in our police.
Let's look at some of the things that you were responsible for in government. As Energy Secretary, do you still love shale gas?
No, I think we don't need...
That was a mistake.
Well, actually, if you look what I did, I passed some very tough environmental regulations, particularly on seismic, which meant that fracking actually hasn't happened. And at the same time, I nearly quadrupled renewable energy. Britain became the world leader in offshore wind. And that has meant the price has come down, so we don't need so much gas.
But you embraced the industry at the time. It's still very, very controversial. Talking about fracking, you said, I love shale gas. Fracking is not the evil thing that some people make it out to be.
Yes, if it abides by the environmental regulations that I put in. If you read the rest of that speech, you'll know that I talked about the precautionary principle, the need that when you have a new industry to make sure it meets all the environmental regulations. And because it hasn't taken off. And I'm proud of my role in doing that.
OK, let's look about your role going forward. You said you want to decarbonise capitalism. And as a very important part of that, you've made the suggestion that we should end domestic flights in the UK. Are you serious about that?
What I've said about domestic flights is when there are alternatives, we can do that. So
there's always alternatives inside the UK.
Well, I don't think there are in the way that we need them to be. We need a lot more train capacity. We need a lot more investment in public transport. Our train system isn't working. So while it's not working, of course you couldn't end some of the domestic flights. But when you do, then you can.
But if we are facing a climate change emergency, then we can't wait for yet more building on railways and roads. We know from HS2 and Crossrail how long that takes. So I ask you again, if we are going to cut down radically the number of domestic flights in this country, how in practical terms do you start to do that?
Well, the first thing I do is cancel the third runway at Heathrow. That is going to allow far more flights to happen. If we stop that, that's a massive step forward. Then, because if you invest in things like the Transpennine Railway, which would really power the north.
But how do you actually stop people flying? Do you have quotas? Do you raise taxes on internal flights? 23 million people in this country fly.
I'm very clear, Andrew. You have to have the alternative in place. There's an awful lot more.
It doesn't sound like you really mean it.
I absolutely mean it, but there's 101 other things that we should be doing to tackle climate change in the meantime. For example, the zero carbon homes regulation that Liberal Democrats put in, that the Conservatives abolished, we should bring that back. The onshore wind revolution.
Do you have any proposals whatever to limit the number of internal flights in the UK?
Yes, well, first of all, I've told you we're going to stop the third runway at Heathrow. Secondly, by investing in public transport, then we have the alternatives.
So lots of carrots, no stick.
Well, when you've got the carrots in place, Andrew, then you can start the ban.
Let's turn to Brexit. Now, the Liberal Democrats did very, very well in the European elections and the local government elections, mainly because an awful lot of people who had voted Labour all their lives were so fed up with the Labour position on all of this that they moved to you. Since then, in the past week, Jeremy Corbyn has changed the policy towards a referendum under virtually all circumstances and said that Labour would campaign in such a referendum for Remain. He has stolen your clothes.
I wish he had. What he's also said is that if there's a Labour government, they will implement a Labour Brexit. So they aren't a Remain party, they're a Brexit party still, and I really worry about that. You're right, the Liberal Democrats have grown massively on the back of our position of Stop Brexit. I'm really proud of that, and we will push that forward. That's why my proposal for a government of national unity would really come in.
Let's talk about that. How does that actually work? Because to a lot of people, government of national unity sounds like pie in the sky.
Well, it isn't. What you'd have to do is have a Labour backbencher. I've posited people like Yvette Cooper or
Have you
Hillary
talked to them? Have you asked them about this?
No, and deliberately so, because I'm flying a kite at the moment. And initially, you're right. People said, "Oh, that looks a bit odd." But in the tea rooms of Westminster,
it'd be good to talk to them in the tea rooms of Westminster.
In the corridors of Westminster, people are turning it. Do you know why? They are deeply worried about a Boris Johnson government, and I share that worry. And they're deeply worried that Corbyn can't provide the leadership. And therefore, if we're going to bring down a Boris Johnson government, as I think we need to, with a vote of no confidence, we have to have an alternative. And I'm proposing an alternative, and people are beginning to see the rationale and the wisdom of that. And as leader of the Liberal Democrats, I would push that, working cross-party. And the reason I do it is I think a government of national unity is the best way to win the people's vote and then to stop Brexit. And that is what people are voting Liberal Democrat for, and I deliver that.
Let's return finally to the contest itself. Liberal Democrats are looking at two candidates, one of whom is a kind of younger, fresh-faced woman, not so well known to the public, and they're thinking, which of these candidates excites us more, will excite the country more, will set the flame alight? Why are you the man to do that?
Because I've got the sharper vision, both to a plan to stop Brexit, but beyond that, a vision when we stop Brexit, a vision to tackle inequality that have caused the Leave vote in many respects, communities that have been left behind, regional inequality, plus my proposals to tackle the climate emergency and to invest in education so Britain becomes the best educated country in the world within a decade. That's a positive vision which people are responding positively to.
We'll find out the answer pretty soon. So, Ed Davey, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. And if you want to see my interview with the other candidate in the race, Joe Swinson, you can still find that on the BBC iPlayer. Both of them will go head-to-head in a Politics Live special on Friday. That's 7 p.m. at BBC Two. Now, what about Labour? This week, Jeremy Corbyn appeared to signal a big shift towards another referendum, but it's still not clear, as we've just heard, if the party will now campaign to remain in all circumstances. And so, let's ask the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, is Labour now a Remain party?
Well, our policy is that that anything that this government comes forward with, particularly if they're going to come forward with no deal, we're going to ask for there to be a public vote. We're going to ask for Remain to be on the ballot paper, and we're going to campaign to Remain. So that sounds pretty Remain to me.
That's a flow chart. I ask again: is Labour now a Remain party
well,
under all circumstances? Ed Davey says no, you're not, because you go into the next election committed to a Labour Brexit.
No, we're not.
You're not going to go into the next election.
Let's just squash all of this. Our policy is that anything that this government comes forward with, or indeed any government comes forward with, we wish to put it back to the people. We want Remain to be on the ballot paper, and we will campaign to Remain. That's our policy. Now, the trade unions have a different policy,
I understand that,
and people are getting that confused.
Okay.
And Ed Davey perhaps doesn't understand, and he thinks that Part B is Labour's policy. It's not.
So at the next election, there are no circumstances in which Labour will be campaigning for Brexit.
I don't know what's going to be in our next manifesto, if that's what you're asking me.
But if you've just said what you've just said, that must follow.
Yeah, well, I understand. I understand. I'm telling you what our policy is, and then I have to tell you that I can't tell you what's happening in our next manifesto, because that's the question people keep asking us. And I do think it's not fair, because no party can tell you what's in their next manifesto. And we're a big old democratic party with 500,000 members, and we have to consult them, and we will work out what our policy is and what our manifesto will be when the time comes.
And your shift or your pivot this week was towards a referendum. Now, the problem with that is that there are not
this afternoon
at People's Vote Rally. I know that.
In a People's Vote Rally, yeah.
Exactly, which will be very great fun, I'm sure. But in the House of Commons, you don't have the votes for that, and that is the hard truth. Therefore, if the pivot to a referendum means anything at all, you need a general election to get there. And in that general election, Labour Party needs to put a referendum into its manifesto. Needs to, otherwise it means nothing.
Of course.
So the Labour Party will go into the referendum, into the general election with the referendum in its manifesto.
I mean, I would have thought so, but I am not someone
who... Yes.
I mean, yes, I get the logic. It's just that I'm just being a bit disciplined about this, because I'm not allowed to write the manifesto. You know, the Tories may have a couple of clever boys who go into a back room and write their manifesto. We do it democratically. So I can tell you what I would argue for, and I can tell you what I think is likely to be in the manifesto, but I can't tell you what will be in the manifesto because it isn't written yet, and we haven't got an election.
Let's look at what we do know is likely to happen, which is the Conservative leadership contest going on. It looks as if Boris Johnson is going to win that, and he's going to come into Parliament committed, if necessary, to taking us out without a deal at the end of October. Now, Labour MPs face a genuine, really hard choice in those circumstances. Do they allow the government to pass some kind of withdrawal agreement? Do they vote with Boris Johnson, as Caroline Flint in that chair was suggesting a couple of weeks ago, to get a withdrawal agreement and to avoid no deal? Or do they say, no, we'll have nothing to do with the Tories under any circumstances and risk no deal? Which way would you advise them to go?
We should not be blackmailed. The point is that we have never agreed with Theresa May's deal. If Boris Johnson comes back with Theresa May's deal in a different font, it still has all the problems that it had before. And so if he's threatening us with, we'll agree with this or we will have no deal, that is unacceptable, and we need to have an injection of democracy, as I have always said, and that should either be a popular vote whereby he tells us, OK, do or die. That's what he's saying. He's saying do or die. Have you heard that? Nobody seems to be saying... He's talking about do or die. What does that mean? I mean, the death of Britain unless he gets Brexit? I mean, what? Really, we need to go back to the people and we need to say to them, is this what you voted for when you voted to leave the European Union? Did you vote for this nonsense? And that's why we need to go back and ask them. Well, and if we don't get that, we need to have a general election. But frankly, we cannot just hand our country over to Boris Johnson and let him do whatever he wants with it. We've got some sort of gentlemanly coup going on at the moment,
Emily
with
Thornbury,
people in the home counties deciding who the next Prime Minister
Thornbury,
should be.
did you watch the Panorama programme on anti-Semitism?
I did.
And what did you feel about it?
I thought it was awful.
The programme was awful, or the revelations were awful?
Both, I think. But more importantly, the revelations. And more importantly, the fact that this has been going on for a very long time, and despite the efforts of our new General Secretary and the fact that she has improved processes and she has done a lot of work on it, it still has not been sorted out. We
watched testimony during that from former members of the party staff, young people often, very, very upset indeed. Do you regard them as credible witnesses?
I think that we shouldn't be going for the messengers, we should be looking at the message. I think that is what is important.
Which is not what the Labour Party has said about this. The Labour Party has said there are already lots of Labour MPs who are talking to us saying they want to help us over the line. It appears that these are former disaffected officials who have both personal and political axes to grind. This throws into doubt their credibility as sources. Do you agree with that?
I can understand that, and I understand that the Labour Party has concerns, and you know the Labour Party has put in a complaint about the way in which that programme was done. My point is something different, which is nobody can pretend that there isn't an ongoing problem within the Labour Party about anti-Semitism, about our processes for dealing with it. And I think it's it's fair to say that Panorama didn't really look at the way in which we'd improved our processes, but I don't pretend that they're perfect, because they're not. And that's why I think
it's not just I would say it's not just the BBC. This is going on and on. The Sunday Times has another whistleblower, Tim Dexter, this morning. Can we just hear a little bit of what he said?
Yeah.
Within an average week, we would see dozens, if not hundreds, of complaints of anti-Semitism being received by the party. Sometimes this could be the most vile, disgusting of things, where people were openly talking about the Holocaust, how it wasn't a bad thing, how it was deserved. The power to make initial decisions on cases lay with the disputes team. That power was taken away from the disputes team into the hands of an individual person. On a number of occasions, or quite regular basis, you'd see decisions, when they did come back, seem to be incredibly lenient.
He's a member of your disputes team, or was. Do you accept what he's saying?
Some of the disputes, some of the complaints will have been complaints from me. I mean, I get, I'm not Jewish, but I get a lot of abuse as well, and I report it. I mean, you know, my children are of Jewish heritage. I hate the fact that they have friends who say we cannot support Labour in current circumstances.
And on it goes. That's the trouble. Another of the former investigations officers, Dan Hogan, has said Labour MPs, and he's talking about people like you, need to have a much firmer stance on this and demand that people are held accountable. This means senior Corbyn aides are removed from their positions. Heads need to roll.
I don't want to personalise this, because I think this issue is more important than a soap opera. I think that the Labour Party has to deal with this issue. And frankly, I welcome the fact that it's a shame and a disgrace that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission have been brought in to look at the Labour Party, but they have, and I think we should now welcome it. And I think we should we should open our doors up and we should say to them, right, we have been trying to improve our processes. Clearly, it's still not working. Can you help us? And if we can set up, as a result of working with them, and I know that they're listening to us, and I know that we're listening to them, hang on, if we can set up a process that is tough and that works and that is an example of good practice, I actually kind of think that would be, that at least would be a good result. Well, and other parties, perhaps, who also have problems with racism, might look to it as an example of good practice.
Well, let's turn to exactly what that might mean. Yeah. Would you support a change in the structures to allow a completely independent unit inside the Labour Party, independent of the leader's office, to look at anti-Semitism allegations? Because that's what it means.
I have been saying since Shami Chakrabarti came out with her report during the time of the previous General Secretary, where she said you needed to have an independent process, and independent of politicians, we needed to have a quasi-judicial process, and unfortunately those recommendations were not implemented in full fast enough, and that, I think, is one of the reasons we are in the state that we're in now. I think that report was traduced by too many groups who didn't really look at what it was that she was saying, and if we had done that then, we wouldn't necessarily be in the mess we are in now.
I understand all of that, but just to be clear, you would support an independent unit to look at these allegations?
I would support whatever the Equalities and Human Rights Commission comes out with as recommendations, and we need to hear what it is that they say, and we need them to work with us.
Have you read the Labour Party's response to the Commission?
No, I haven't.
Do you think you should read it? Do you think you should be given it to read?
I think the trouble is that we have again, this is part of our structure, and it would be interesting to look at it, but we have the Shadow Cabinet that deals with the politics, national politics, and we have the National Executive Committee that deals with the party. I'm not on the National Executive Committee, which is why I've not been given a copy of it.
Tom Watson thinks that the Shadow Cabinet should read it as well. He's been engaged in what has become an extraordinary war of words at the top of the party. Swear words cast all around, people getting very, very angry. Jenny, formerly the General Secretary, particularly angry. This is what she said to Tom Watson recently. She said, by choosing to ignore the steps taken by the party and commenting so uncritically about the Panorama programme, you are complicit in creating a perception that anti-Semitism is more prevalent in the Labour Party. Do you think that he's complicit in that?
I wish he wasn't attacking somebody who's going through chemotherapy. I think that is a mistake. She's the General Secretary of the Labour Party, but we know that she's very ill. I think it's completely inappropriate to personalise this. That is my point. And
Len McCluskey called him an effing disgrace.
I know.
Do you agree with that?
I think that Len and Tom and Jenny have a great deal of history, and we are not talking soap opera. I don't care, I'm afraid, about the soap opera. I actually care about the fact that I have a Jewish member of staff who, when she goes to family weddings, can't say who she works for. Even though I fight on this issue a lot, she cannot admit who she works for or what she does because she doesn't want to spend the rest of the day defending herself. I don't want that. I want us to sort this out.
But for goodness sake, this has gone on for 2 years now. Why is it not being sorted out? Who's responsible?
I think that it is there's a large number of reasons for this, and we could spend quite a long time about it. I think that we didn't follow Shami's recommendations, and we should have. I think that you didn't understand the importance of quasi-judicial processes. I think that people also, on the one hand, they say there shouldn't be political interference, and then they say Jeremy Corbyn should sort this out, which obviously there's a contradiction in that. If we had a process that was robust, that was properly funded, I mean, it is better. It's 4 times faster than it used to be. So we have come a long way, but I'm afraid we still need to go much further.
One last thing I must ask you about Sir Kim Darroch and the row of that. Do you think the Mail on Sunday was right to publish those telegrams? You may well be Foreign Secretary in due course. You probably know Kim Darroch, and you know what's happened to him. Was the Mail right to publish?
Listen, it's newsworthy. Any journalist who'd been handed
by and large,
something
yes.
it was wrong for it to be leaked. It was wrong for President Trump to throw a wobbler and behave like a toddler. It was wrong for Theresa May to be as weak as she was. But the real villain of the piece is Boris Johnson, who refused to stand with one of our most senior diplomats, and that is not the way to behave.
Emily Thornberry, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. What a day ahead for sport, as we have said, including, of course, England batting to win the World Cup. For the first time ever, I've been talking to the former England cricket captain Andrew Strauss about a new film, The Edge. It charts the immense highs and lows experienced by the England players who became the best test match team in the world.
Forget what you think you know. Test cricket is a battle between time and the mind.
I've got a problem with the way you practice, the amount you're drinking.
Things needed to change. We needed a plan.
The target, to be the first England team to reach #1 in the world. It's an unbelievably challenging game.
We were a structured winning machine. Playing for England is the ultimate. But it becomes a bit like a drug.
We wanted to be England's best team ever. We wanted to get to #1 in the rankings for the first time. And that was a focus for us over the next it was almost an obsession for us over the next 3.5 years. Can we make this work? And that brought quite a disparate group of people together and gave them a commonality, a drive, a purpose, a motivation to do a really special thing, and they all bought into it. And I hope the film conveys that about this was a band of brothers doing something special together.
How much would you give to be the best?
Making a movie!
Don't blink first.
And the sense of team is very, very important at that point.
Well, it's the only thing, and when I watched that film, I got very emotional because I realised I had this incredible shared experience with this group of people, this incredible bond with them, and actually now we've gone our separate ways, and so this film is a way of bringing us back together again, and for us to relive some special moments in our lives.
You go right to the top of the tree and then it goes wrong. What happened that made it go wrong?
I think actually, if we're honest, we probably became so obsessed by winning that we stopped remembering that this was about a group of people. And so the winning sort of got more important than us staying together as a group and staying tight. And I think over time that undermined what we were trying to do. And there were obviously issues within the camp that came to the surface.
There's a sort of jaw-breaking moment in the film when Peterson says that he was actually yearning for an injury so he could be off for 6 months. That must have shocked you when you heard it.
Yeah, it did shock me, but in a way I can get it. He was on the road for 12, 13 years non-stop on that conveyor belt, and when you're on it, it's very hard to get off it. And so, I have a lot of sympathy for what he went through, but he wasn't the only one. There are plenty of other people that went through it as well.
We weren't aware of what your teammates are going through.
I did isolate myself.
Crying in a dressing room. Everything just seemed to come tumbling down.
It became a life or death situation.
Those are the sacrifices you make to be an international sportsman. They're the sacrifices you need to make if you want to be the best in the world.
But the problem is, to do that, to be the very best you can be in that relatively narrow area, you have to cast away so much of the rest of life. Family goes for long periods of time, normal mental balance goes for long periods of time, and people are driving themselves almost nuts.
Yeah, and I've asked myself that question, was it all worth it?
Yeah.
And I think my answer is yes, because if you are a professional cricketer, if you play for England, you want to be remembered as someone who does something special. You want to be, if you're going to go through most of that sacrifice anyway, why don't you just go through a little bit more and make sure you've got something at the end of it that you can go, I'm genuinely proud of that.
When you look back at this film, do you think there are ways I could have done it that would have held it together better?
I think we became too ruthless in our pursuit of winning and started not thinking enough about how we win and how we are as a group of people, and I think that was the big mistake for us.
It's a very, very big summer for cricket. Do you think this is going to inspire a whole new generation to take up the game? Because every sport is looking around at the youngsters, wondering how many people are coming through, are enough people coming through?
It's a very, very exciting thing to see England on the up and playing the right style of cricket. It's a showcase year for the game of cricket, World Cup and Ashes, and if we win both of those, if England play in the way that I think they can, lots of people that wouldn't otherwise watch the game of cricket will be riveted and captivated by what's going on.
What are your own ambitions for your own career?
I can never separate myself fully from cricket. It's part of my DNA. I love being director of England cricket and helping form the strategy around the World Cup. But for a time being, I've got to move away a little bit. My wife unfortunately passed away in December, and I've started a foundation in her name, the Ruth Strauss Foundation, looking into the causes of rare forms of lung cancer and trying to provide support for families and patients along the way. So that's a real focus. That's a passion of mine at the moment. I'll come back to cricket at some point.
I also know that you were asked to get involved in politics. Was that a ball you were pleased to dodge when you look at what's going on these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think anyone who's passionate about our country wants to see us do great things, and so in that sense I'm political, but I think it's a big step to jump into that fray. That's a game that I'm not sure what the rules of that game are. Do you know the rules of that game? I suppose you do.
I don't think there are any rules.
Okay, well that's worrying.
There's one great big arena, and the roar is almost as loud, and the passions are almost as great. But I think you're wise to avoid that one.
Thank you. Okay.
Andrew Strauss, brilliant talking.
Thank you
very
Cheers,
much
thank you.
indeed. Thank you. Andrew Strauss there, and that cracking documentary, The Edge, is released in cinemas this Friday and will be available on DVD and other platforms from the 22nd of July. Now, this week, the Work and Pension Secretary Amber Rudd said she now accepted a no-deal Brexit should be part of the armoury of any future Prime Minister. That surprised some people, as just a few months ago, she defied the Tory whip to try to rule out a no-deal. An elegant pivot to reality? Or a screeching careerist U-turn? Amber Rudd is with me now. Which is it, Amber Rudd?
I hope it's the first, Andrew.
An elegant pivot. You
Yes.
accept you've changed?
I accept I've changed, but I accept the circumstances have changed as well. When I did that in March with a number of my colleagues, we were trying to make sure that we had more time to look at alternative strategies. So one of them was trying to make sure that we could look at whether we could get a compromise further, whether we could get the third version of the withdrawal agreement through, and many of us thought that would go through. Unfortunately, it didn't. And then we had the opportunity to work with Labour. We tried to make sure that we found a consensus there, but that didn't work either. So I think the circumstance...
running out of options, because you then said, back then you said it would be disastrous, no deal. Do you still feel that?
I still think that no deal would be bad for the economy, bad for security and bad for the union. So one of the good things is that both candidates feel that they are committed to trying to get a deal. But I have accepted that we now need to allow no deal to be part of the leverage to make sure that people compromise more. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing a bit of compromising. I would hope that the EU will compromise and that the ERG will compromise too.
Well, let's look at the other things you said back at the same time. You said, is it another referendum preferable to no deal? Absolutely. Do you still agree with that?
I don't anymore, no, because I think that we've run out of looking at all those options. We've looked at indicative votes. We've had a number of votes on alternative ways of handling the expiring of Article 50, which now expires at the end of October. And I think that the best plan we've got now is one where we leave no deal as part of the leverage, but also acknowledging that nobody wants that. And Boris Johnson, I know, has said it's only a 1 in a million chance. Jeremy Hunt has a clear plan.
But you also said, because you were very lucid about it, you said, we are not leaving on the 31st of October with a deal. Parliament will block a no-deal Brexit, and there isn't time to do a revised deal. My view is that a new Prime Minister should sit down with the new EU Commissioner on the 1st of November and negotiate a new deal for Britain. Again, is that still your view?
I still think that Parliament may well block a no-deal Brexit. The numbers are potentially there to do it, and we have to be aware of that.
And that there still isn't time to do a revised deal.
I have been very impressed by Jeremy Hunt's ability to set out a clear plan, to say how he's going to do it, and if I may say so, all the time while being Foreign Secretary in a very busy time. He's been running across the country, doing all these hustings and also being a very effective Foreign Secretary. So I've got a bit more confidence than I would have expected when I wrote that he can actually do this.
So you still think that a new Prime Minister could sit down on the 1st of November with the new Commissioner and negotiate a new deal? Because if you do think that, you can't serve in a Boris Johnson cabinet.
Well, I'm not interested at the moment in talking about anybody's cabinet except Jeremy Hunt's. We're still in the middle of the leadership race. Laura Kuenssberg announced just a few days ago that she expected that only half of the Tories had voted. So we think that they're still breaking quite dramatically towards Jeremy. So I'm still out here fighting for Jeremy Hunt, who I think would be the better Prime Minister.
That's absolutely clear. But would you serve in a Boris Johnson cabinet?
Well, as I say, I'm fighting for a cabinet cabinet for Jeremy Hunt. And while that is still the case, I don't think we should speculate on the alternative candidate.
You very, very famously said that Boris Johnson was the life and soul of the party, but you wouldn't want him to drive you home afterwards. Have you changed your view about him?
Andrew, I know you're very keen for me to talk about Boris, but I am backing Jeremy Hunt. So I'm not going to indulge in all the chat about the alternative candidate when I'm still fighting for every vote for Jeremy.
The reason I'm asking about this is that some people looking at your change in position are saying this is pure careerism. You want to be in a Boris Johnson cabinet. You'd like to have one of the senior officers of state in a Boris Johnson cabinet. That is what all of this is about. Your colleague Nick Bowles said this, quoting former colleague Nick Bowles said this. So she will let Boris Johnson drive her home after all, so long as it's in a ministerial limo.
I saw that, but I wonder if you saw the next tweet that Nick Bowles also put up, which was reflecting on the work that I've been doing in the Work and Pensions Department, the good work he was kind enough to say that I've been doing there. And that is what is driving me to make the point that there is an important job to be done here in my department.
He's a generous-spirited fellow, and I want to come on to the Work and Pensions Department right now. Is it still the case that you believe that a no-deal Brexit would increase homelessness, the use of food banks and possibly even suicide in this country?
I haven't been saying that. I maintain my position that a no-deal Brexit is bad for this country and will be difficult to handle. And to be fair, even most Brexiteers say that at the very least it will have adverse consequences. So I'm very clear that we need to be frank with the British people, that no deal is not easy. It'll be something that'll challenge us. But if we have to do it, we have to have it there as a backstop, as to coin a phrase, by the end of October. But I'm no longer saying that I will lie down in front of the bulldozers if it arrives.
Well, because the reason I'm asking, there was a leaked document from your department, went to the Times a little while ago, and it said that civil servants needed to explore how we would deal with a rise in homelessness and other potential impacts, like a rise in suicide rates or an increase in food banks use. That is the advice going around in your department. And I'm asking, as the head of the department,
yes.
Have you seen that, and do you agree with it or not agree
So there
with
were two parts, if I may say, to no deal that would impact on my department. One of them is, are we ready for it in terms of making sure that we pay the pensions, we pay the benefits overseas, as we would need to if there was a no deal? And the answer to that is yes, we are ready for that. The second part, which is more difficult to assess, is would there be a loss of employment? Would we enter some sort of recession? And that is difficult to judge. But if we did, then the Work and Pensions Department would have to be ready for that, and there would be consequences.
You told MPs that you had a hardship fund being prepared. Is that ready?
We will be ready should we need it. But one of the things, if I may say, that I'm pleased with in Jeremy Hunt's plan is that he is very frank about the difficulties that come with no-deal Brexit, and he has set out the plans and the money needed to be able to ameliorate that. So, for instance, he said there'll be £6 billion for farming and for fishing. And in my constituency of Hastings, that's really important.
Can you give us some indication of how big the hardship fund is going to be?
No, at the moment we're still looking at what might be needed.
And are you hiring more officials just in case there's a rise in unemployment around?
We are preparing for it. We are making sure that should that happen, should there be a no-deal Brexit, and should there be an adverse consequence to the employment levels, the great employment levels that we've got in this country, then we'll have to make sure that we do recruit more people in order to deal with it.
The freeze on benefit levels is supposed to be ending next spring. If there is a no-deal Brexit, will that happen?
I would expect that to happen whatever the situation, because it needs to happen. And I've already had conversations with the Chancellor, and I would expect to do so with any future government. It's essential that we take that freeze off.
Can you guarantee that it will end next year?
Well, it's not for me to guarantee. I'm not the Chancellor, but I will certainly guarantee that I will be making a very strong case for it, whatever role I may or may not be playing.
Let's look a little bit more at the whole issue of austerity and welfare. How much have the two candidates, you mentioned Jeremy Hunt a lot today, but also Boris Johnson, how much have they pledged in this huge new spending spree to reverse benefit cuts?
I haven't seen any of that, so I will...
Nothing?
Nothing, it's absolutely right. I will be making
So how do you feel about that?
I will be going back, if I'm in this role, but who knows, to make the case for how we need to support people in benefits. And the other case that I've already started making, and I've made privately in conversations before the leadership race started to both of them, is that we need to do something about housing. The local housing allowance is the bit that I would like to focus on. And currently, I've been working with MHCLG rather, to look at a bid into the spending review to make sure that we do more about housing.
So what does this say to you about the priorities for the leadership candidates? That, you know, they're talking about tax cuts at the top, they're talking about more money for the military, but not about the people who've had such a hard time over the last few years.
I think tax cuts at the top is not the way to approach it. I would much rather see emphasis on making sure that, for instance, we raise the living wage, that we focus on, as Jeremy Hunter said, making sure that people on the lower incomes keep more of their money. That's where we should be focusing.
I mean, the IFS says, I think 35 billion has come out of the welfare system since 2010. That's a huge amount of money. Do you think it's time to start to put some of that money back again?
Well, some of that has already been put back, and my predecessor managed to get 15 billion from the Treasury over 3 years to put back to make sure that we do raise it. And overall...
My figure was a net figure, so that's still...
Overall, the system is still more generous than the previous system it replaces by 2023.
What about the problem of people simply not getting their universal credit benefits when they're looking for them? There's been a real spike in food bank use in those places where UC has been rolled out as against those places where it hasn't yet been rolled out, which suggests this so-called 5-week or 6-week gap is really serious for lots of families. Would you make it a priority to bring that down?
I have acknowledged that the early rollout of universal credit did, in my view, contribute to the rise in food banks. And part of that was because people weren't able to access the money they were entitled to, even within that period. So in my own constituency, only about 50 to 55% were getting it on time. But now it's about 86, 87%. So I'm much more content with it.
Well, content, but nevertheless, 1.6 million food parcels were handed out last year, a record number. Do you accept some responsibility for that?
I have taken steps, as has previous Secretaries of State, to make sure that people can access money much earlier. So, for instance, they can access quite a substantial loan on day one of the application.
So that's what you've done. And do you accept any responsibility for it, is what I'm asking?
Well, I accept responsibility for everything in my department.
Right. Let me turn to another big issue this morning, which is the treatment of Sir Kim Darroch, the ambassador in Washington. What did you think when you watched Boris Johnson reply to Andrew Neil and others about his culpability for that resignation?
I've known Sir Kim Darroch for a while. I worked with him as Home Secretary, and we did work together that has helped to keep this country safe. So I'm an enormous admirer of the work that Kim Darroch has done, and entirely of our civil service overall, our Foreign Office. And I was disappointed by Boris Johnson's response to that. I think the correct response was to stand up for our ambassadors, and we discussed it at Cabinet last week, and the Prime Minister was absolutely clear that he had our full support as a whole Cabinet.
So you would suspect the Prime Minister herself is also disappointed with Boris Johnson's response?
Well, it will be for her to comment on that, but she has been very clear that Sir Kim Darroch should be stood up for, and she regretted his resignation.
Well, his career is now over there. Who should appoint the new ambassador?
I don't know the answer to that. I imagine a new Prime Minister will have their own views on it, and I hope that they'll consider what is mostly in the interest of this country first.
There's been a big argument this morning about press freedom. I'm sure you think that it was wrong to leak those cables, but was the Mail on Sunday wrong to publish those cables?
No, I don't think the Mail on Sunday was wrong to publish them. We have a very precious freedom of press legislation here. The press has had its difficulties with politicians. Politicians had their difficulty with the press and with the police. I was, in fact, Home Secretary when I worked with Karen Bradley as Culture Secretary, not to go ahead with Leveson 2 because we'd made the progress that we'd made. So I think we have the right balance.
There's a big constitutional row here about the possibility of proroguing or effectively locking the gates on Parliament in the event of a possible no deal. So John Major, the former Prime Minister, has said that he is prepared to take the government to court to stop that happening. Would you be alongside him? Would you support that?
Well, I respect John Major for what he said, and I respected him for his views in the past as well. I think that proroguing Parliament would be a mistake. And if
More than a mistake, surely. I mean, it would be a big constitutional moment.
Well, yes, sure. I mean, you can use that phrase. I think it would be a mistake, and I think that it would be the wrong thing to do, and I would always argue against it.
The Chancellor himself is talking about what sounds like a form of sit-in in the House of Commons to stop it.
Well, that's a very strong indication of how MPs feel it's the wrong thing to do. MPs, I think, across both parties of every level think it was the wrong thing to do, and I would urge any Prime Minister to put that aside.
Would you sit in with the Chancellor if there was an attempt to prorogue Parliament, to stop Parliament sitting?
I think I would use my own tactics to try and stop that happening, and I encourage anyone else to consider their own version as well.
You've had a career that's gone in all sorts of directions, famously. Are you still on the up?
Oh, I don't know. What I am, Andrew, is very committed to the job that I've got in hand, which I'm incredibly proud of the people who work in my department and the work I'm doing to improve it.
Amber Rudd, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now look at what's coming up on BBC One at 11:30.
Analysis by a Muslim organisation says too much coverage of their faith is negative. Does the media need to change, or is it just reporting the truth?
Only 1% of young people say they belong to the Church of England. We'll discuss what the future holds.
And quiz whiz Anne Hegarty, better known as the governess on The Chase, tells us her secret to success.
Join us at 11:30.
That's all for this week. A big show next week. I have absolutely no idea about who will be here. Join me at the same time next Sunday. Until then, goodbye.